Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to the final episode of History for the Curious. I'm Baruch Levine, Rabbi at Brunsbury Park, and we are one of 4 participating communities in this very unique series, along with South Hampstead, Central Square Minyan, and Beth Medrash Macdougall in Leeds. I suppose one of the silver linings of this period is the way in which it has uniquely brought communities together without any regard for geographic distance or separation, and to be able to hold a series together with 3 other communities and to come together, learn together, discover together, and make new friends online, hopefully with a view to being able to engage in real life in due course, is certainly one of the blessings of the time we're living through. So over the past couple of weeks, our series has taken us through Spanish Jewish history, ranging from Maimonides in the 12th century and last week, 16th century Spain. This evening, we move on to 18th century America. And I suppose what also differentiates this evening from last week and the previous week is the fact that we were given a heads up in advance of each of those sessions as to who the personalities we were going to be studying was. Whereas this evening, we're in the dark. And Aubrey, no doubt you have, having kept us in suspense, 2 really fascinating personalities to share with us this evening. Looking forward, and thanks so much for your contribution, your knowledge, and your insight throughout this series. Over to you, and please forgive me if I slip away shortly. I have another commitment, but I certainly wanted to join you to kick off, and we'll stay for as long as I'm able.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And yes, this week, the protagonist's name has been deliberately anonymized, if one can put it that way. We will reveal his identity shortly, but not quite yet. I want you on the edge of your seats so that perhaps there will be a little bit more excitement added to this evening's lecture. Now, when nowadays we think of the words American Jewish spy, the name that generally comes to mind is Jonathan Pollard, even though he was doing so on behalf of a friendly country and was passing over information that had actually been promised to them, but technically it was espionage. Perhaps if we were to go slightly further back into the 20th century, the names of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg would resonate, the 2 American Jews who spied on behalf of the Soviet Union and were eventually sentenced to death. But tonight, I would like to talk about a Jewish spy who spied on behalf of America, in New York, no less. Although, I guess being British, it might be difficult for me to refer to him as a patriot because he was spying, of course, on the Brits. He stands out in the cause of the American Revolution. He risked his life. He was imprisoned not once, but twice, and in fact, sentenced to death on the 2nd occasion. And when we bear in mind that more American soldiers died in British prisons during the revolution than on the battlefield, we can readily understand that being imprisoned was more than simply an unpleasant situation. And his contribution was not limited to the war itself. Yet you are unlikely to have heard of him because his treatment subsequent to his death, and I would say the century that followed, is somewhat of a blemish on America's public record. But in order to understand who he was, we perhaps need to understand a little bit more about Jewish life in America in the 18th century. Jews first came to North America almost as the result of an accident. As we mentioned last week when dealing with Marranos, Jews were given somewhat of a some leeway to practice Judaism as long as it was not externally noticeable, if they left Spain and Portugal and went across to Southern and Latin America, which were being colonized by the Spanish and Portuguese, and there was a requirement for a merchant class. So they turned a blind eye to some of the activities that were going on there. In 1636, in Recife in Brazil, the region was conquered by the Dutch, who had recently become independent, and they were very tolerant of other religions. And hence, the first synagogue in the Americas came into being, the Kahal Tzur Yisrael. We still have its location, and the street on which it was originally located has been renamed as Jewish Street. And the Dutch held on to Recife from 1636 till 1654, at which time they lost control, and the Jews there, not wishing to put themselves back into the hands of the Portuguese, left, and they fled north. One ship, the St. Catherine, made it as far as New Amsterdam, known to us today as New York, which at the time was under Dutch control, and 22 Jews disembarked in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in September of 1654, and shortly thereafter, within the next 10 days, held Rosh Hashanah services, even though they did not have the allowance to have any public synagogue service, but they met in a single house, and they conducted Rosh Hashanah davening with what might be called an inauspicious start to Jewish life in North America. And the community grew, one would not say by leaps and bounds, but by small numbers. In 1722, there are 20 households named there. By 1677, they were already in possession of a cemetery. The cemetery still stands to this day, and I will show you some images thereof afterwards because it will become relevant to the second personality that we will be discussing this evening. And therefore, there were about 1.5% of the population of New York were Jewish at the beginning of the 1700s. Now, what's interesting is that although they were only 1.5%, perhaps 2%, but no more, they controlled approximately 10% of the overseas trade, which in and of itself is perhaps not that surprising. Jews adapt naturally to environment, and overseas trade often required knowledge of languages or having contacts at a base across the Atlantic, which for the Jews, whether it was Holland or other such locations, was doable. And hence, being 1.5% of the population, controlling 10% of the overseas trade does not surprise us that much. However, if we juxtapose that statistic to what takes place in 1776 or thereabouts, where the Jewish population has fallen to being only 1% of the total population of New York, not because there are less Jews, but simply because more non-Jews have moved in. It's become more populated. So they are now 1% of the population, and they now only control 1% of the overseas trade. And the reason for that was that New York's Jews had become rooted there. They now swapped colonial transience for a sense of permanence. They felt somewhat at home there. And as you are aware, there was no ghetto in America. There was no overt anti-Jewish sentiment. There were many positions open to them, and there were very few disabilities. In fact, I will read to you a couple of extracts of a diary of a non-Jew dated November the 2nd, 1748, where he writes that besides for the sects of Christians, there are many Jews settled in New York. They have a synagogue and houses and are allowed to keep shops in town. They have likewise several ships and enjoy all the privileges common to other inhabitants of this town and province. During my residence in New York, I was frequently in company with Jews, and I noticed that these people never boiled any meat for themselves on Saturday, but that they always did it the day before, and that in winter they kept a fire going continuously during the whole Saturday. So they were somewhat of a curiosity, but we note that they are basically keeping Shabbat in one way or another, as we would expect. He then writes, they commonly ate no pork, yet I have been told by several men of credit that especially amongst the young Jews, when they are traveling, did not make the least difficulties when other meat was placed before them. So sort of, kosher at home and not out in the street. It's not a novel 21st or even 20th century phenomenon. And then he writes, I was in their synagogue last evening, and each time I had gone, I was put in a particular seat which was set apart for strangers or Christians. A young rabbi read the divine service, which was partly in Hebrew and partly in the rabbinical dialect, by which he actually means not Yiddish, but Aramaic. This is the prayer service that we're talking about. Both men and women were dressed entirely in the English fashion, and the former, the men in other words, had their hats on, and I did not once see them take them off during service, which for a Christian would be something to note. The galleries were appropriated to the ladies, and during prayers, the men spread a white cloth, the talit, over their heads. And I observed that the wealthier sort of people had a much richer sort of cloth than the poorer ones. So there probably was a Jewish bookstore somewhere in the Lower East Side selling a talit and probably tefillin to the inhabitants. Many of the men had Hebrew books in which they sang and read alternately. The rabbi stood in the middle and read with his face turned towards the east. He spoke, however, so fast as to make it almost impossible for anyone to understand what he said. So there you have a contemporary account of a non-Jew recording that Jewish life in New York seemed to be above board. Yet, for all of that, the average Jew in the colonies was against the old country at heart. Meaning, for them, for many of them, Europe represented repression, represented anti-Semitism, and therefore, given the choice, they were more likely eventually to side with the colonials than with the British. Enter our hero of the evening, Chaim Solomon. He was born in Poland in 1740 to a family that originated from Spain or Portugal. and they had made their way to southern Poland, which was not entirely unusual. Clearly, they were a minority there, but it wasn't unheard of. In fact, if you've been in Krakow to the Altar Synagogue on the main square in Kazimierz in the Jewish district, you will see that the architecture there is not purely Ashkenazi, even though it was built in the late 1490s. And that's because it was somewhat influenced by these immigrants from the Iberian Peninsula. So his parents have settled down, his grandparents already, in fact, have settled down in Poland. And over the next 20 years, he would travel through Europe, picking up a number of different languages and an acute understanding of finance. He would make his way via London to New York and arrive there around 1772. He would become a financial broker for merchants engaged in trade, especially overseas trade. However, he became very friendly with an individual by the name of Alexander Macdougall, who, as the name suggests, was Scottish, somewhat of a Scottish firebrand, and he would eventually become a major general in George Washington's army. And he was, by 1775, this Alexander Macdougall, was the leader of the Sons of Liberty. And they were an underground colonial group that promoted independence and that were quite unhappy with British rule. The Boston Tea Party is, of course, known to all of you, but there were other excesses and other taxes which they were unhappy with. I'm now going to share the screen so you don't have to suffer looking just at a rabbi with a whole load of books behind him. And we will go all the way to the top of this page. There we are. And we have here the ketubah of Chaim Solomon, who got married to a woman called Rachel Franks, who was from a known family in the area. And this ketubah is preserved in an American Jewish museum stroke library in Manhattan. And he has now become secretly not just an admirer of the Sons of Liberty, of colonial aspirations, but actually involved in intelligence. And this will become quite important because George Washington worked out that if they were going to be successful in any revolution against an established country like England, they would need intelligence gathering capabilities. In fact, he spent up to 10% of his military war chest, of his funds, on intelligence operations. And Chaim Solomon was recruited. He became a spy for the American cause. And in fact, it's quite interesting, of course, that we are giving this lecture today, being that we are almost the 4th of July. It is an auspicious date in COVID-related activities, but also very auspicious in the American calendar, because on the 4th of July, 1776, the 13 colonies declared their independence. And this would eventually result in the American Revolution, in the war in which Chaim Solomon served as a spy. In September 1776, he was arrested. New York had suffered setbacks in colonial terms. The British had inflicted victories in Long Island. And if you think traffic is bad, getting from Long Island via Brooklyn to Manhattan, try it in the summer of 1776, where the British evicted all the Americans from Brooklyn, which was so termed back then as well, and they retreated to Manhattan. Chaim Solomon in September is arrested and sentenced to jail in the Provost jail in New York. But what happens unusually is that the terms of his incarceration are somewhat relaxed when he is brought to the attention of a general, a Hessian general, a German general who is in charge of mercenary German troops under British control in the Americas. Why are there German troops under British direction? Because the English Parliament managed to negotiate treaties with some of the German states, paying them quite large sums of money, and hired almost 30,000 mercenaries, almost 30,000 troops were nominally under British command. But it was poorly organized, and beyond that, the language barrier between the German mercenaries and the British commanders was somewhat of an obstruction. And this was the case not only on the battlefield, but even in the jails, where you had Hessian troops, sometimes in charge of these prisons, without having the proper command of language. And this came to the attention of one of the German generals, and he discovered that Chaim Solomon had a gift for languages. So he made a deal with him whereby he would lighten his sentence to something like 12 or 18 months on the proviso that he would translate for the troops there the demands of the prisoners and the requirements of the Hessians over their prisoners. Not only did Chaim Solomon take up the opportunity, he used it to further engage in underground activities and managed to connect some of these American prisoners with outside help, and allowed some of those prisoners, or was instrumental in having some of those prisoners escape. Now, the numbers given are often inaccurate. In fact, there is no way of knowing the exact numbers, but a number of 500 prisoners is bandied about. There is no way of checking. It could be 10% of that. It could be that that amount is actually what really took place. He also convinced some of the Hessian troops who were being badly paid to defect to the American cause. So he was quite what we would call in Yiddish a Kochleffel, right? He would stir up trouble, but in this particular case, he made sure to remain below the radar so that the British would not pick up on his activities. He is re-released into New York. Now, New York was the headquarters within the 13 colonies. This is the headquarters of the British in North America. And he is rearrested, this time in 1778. And in August of 1778, he is sentenced to death, and he manages to escape. He escapes to Philadelphia, which at the time was the main colonial city during the Revolution. The interesting thing is, as we mentioned, he was arrested for the first time in 1776, spent at least 12 months in prison, and rearrested in 1778. In front of you, you have his ketubah, his marriage document, which took place in 1777. So you would assume he would have enough on his mind that marriage wouldn't have been the prospect that most made itself known to him. Nevertheless, he got married at the time, and by 1778, he actually was the father of a child. He makes his way to Philadelphia, and it is here that he would be the greatest contributor to the war efforts. Now, you might ask yourself, surely somebody who has been imprisoned twice and has been sentenced to death has done enough that you can't really top that. But actually, there was a more urgent requirement of his other skills, his pre-spying days skills, and that was brokerage. Philadelphia was a port city with foreign markets whose trade he knew, and he at first engaged privately in this concern, but eventually the French consul appointed Solomon as an agent for the French government, in fact, as the paymaster general for the French army in America. Now, you might be asking yourselves, French, aren't we talking about the British versus the colonials? So we have to understand that obviously not all of what we would nowadays call the United States was either in colonial or British hands at the time. The Spanish were there, the French were there. And the only thing, in fact, that united the French and the Spanish and the colonials is that none of them liked Britain, and at certain times would all collude together against England. And therefore, being the paymaster general of the French army meant you were helping the colonial cause. Now, I will take you down to the next image on here. You have a newspaper advert of Chaim Solomon placed in the Freeman's Journal on July 31st, 1782. And at the very top, it says there, broker to the Office of Finance, to the Consul General of France, and to the Treasurer of the French Army. That was his job initially when he arrives, when he makes an impression in Philadelphia. However, things were changing for the Americans. In 1781, Robert Morris would be appointed to the position of Superintendent of Finances of the young Republic, which I guess nowadays in England we would call the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He becomes the person in charge of America's war treasury. And on many occasions, up to 75 occasions in his private diary, he will record the words, "I sent for Chaim Solomon." He would use him to provide hard cash for the 13 colonies, because the colonies would finance the war efforts in specie, meaning they would provide tobacco or agricultural products or hides of animals to the war chest, which is great, but it's not going to pay wages. And Chaim Solomon would arrange to have these things bought and sold, etc. He would also dispose of captured merchandise. And this job he performed on behalf of the American government initially. Well, it wasn't necessarily a government, but on behalf of the American Revolutionary War Committee. And therefore, having originally worked for the French, he was now back to working entirely for the Americans. That was his day job. He would also, however, float loans. He contributed to needy soldiers. He equipped military units with his own money, and he lent money to several delegates of Congress who were representative of these 13 colonies, but sometimes it took a while for the money to get through to them, and they were not necessarily by any means people of standing, of independent financial wealth, and it would be Chaim Solomon who would advance them money, to the extent that James Madison, who became the 4th president of the United States of America, wrote back to Virginia, "I have been a pensioner for some time on the favor of Chaim Solomon." Other needy delegates to whom he lent money included Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, respectively the 3rd and 5th presidents of the United States of America. So he was intimately connected with the nascent birth of the American Republic. And between the period of 1781 to 1784, the records show that between his own personal investment, but mainly as a result of his brokerage and of his fundraising, he raised over $650,000, which in today's money is over $1 billion. Not a million, but $1 billion, for the war effort. Having said that, his greatest single contribution came in August of 1781, when the Continental Army, in other words, the Americans, had trapped Lieutenant General Cornwallis in Yorktown, which was on the sea, and the French Navy was behind them, and the British had nowhere to go. And George Washington wanted to complete the revolution. He wanted to force the British into surrender, and therefore he pushed for this last battle. There was one problem. He had no money. He had troops who hadn't been fed. He didn't have weapons. He didn't have proper uniforms. And he reckoned that he needed $20,000. So he sent for Robert Morris, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Nowadays, it seems that you can just print money, you can just award money to anybody, billions, and I don't know, somehow it seems to work, which is great. But back in the day, they were stuck. And Robert Morris said, "Sorry, I haven't got any money for you either." Now, at this point, legend tells us that Washington says, "Send for Chaim Solomon." Whether he actually said those words or not is, once again, a matter of debate. But what is undisputed is that Chaim Solomon was sent for, and that he raised the necessary $20,000 in order to finance this final battle, which ended with the British Lieutenant General signing a surrender. So obviously, as I say, quite involved in what is going on during the war on more than one front. He was also involved in Jewish community affairs while he was in Philadelphia. The congregation Mikveh Yisrael built they had the largest congregation during the war, and they built one of the earliest synagogues in the United States, and he was the greatest single contributor to the cause. So an important individual and a life well lived. Why have most people never heard of him? So here we come to the tragic element thereof. In January 1785, at the age of 45, he dies suddenly. A complication of tuberculosis, which he picked up while he was in a British jail, a British prison in New York. And when he died, the amount of bonds that he held will be shown to you on the, well, hang on, we'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, this is what he held when he died, which is about $350,000 of certificates, shares, bonds, etc. Unfortunately, this was worth almost nothing. It was worth 10 cents on the dollar because the American Republic did not have the means to repay this. An almost equal threat to the war itself was the specter of bankruptcy. And therefore, even though he was owed a large sum of money, so to speak, it was not repaid. And he had taken out personal loans on behalf of the United States, none of which were repaid, to the degree that his wife and 4 kids were turfed out of their home, and the only thing they had was the furniture which they had owned in their own residence. And after the government was established, bills were repeatedly brought up in Congress to repay his family, but they always failed to pass. And as a result, no compensation or adjustment was ever made. And for the next more than 1 century, there was almost radio silence on the fate and on the accomplishments of Chaim Solomon. He was almost airbrushed out of history, not because of anti-Semitism that has been claimed but been disproved, but simply there were more important matters. Many of the records dealing with his estate were burnt when Washington itself was burnt by the British in 1814. There was a war that flared up that started in 1812 between the British and the Americans, and many of the records were lost, and therefore there was little ongoing record. LaGuardia, when he was mayor of New York, set aside a Chaim Solomon Day, and in World War II, the US Liberty ship SS Chaim Solomon was named in his honor. But more or less, the honor that was really due to him was not given to him until almost 200 years after he died. Because on March the 25th, 1975, the Postal Service in America issued a commemorative stamp in tribute to Chaim Solomon, and I think this will be the next slide. There we are. It was a series of stamps which honored the contributors to the cause. There you have Chaim Solomon's name, financial hero, and on the back of the stamp, which you might think is a rather odd place to write, but nevertheless, in this series of stamps, that's where they did inscribe the reason behind the issue of these stamps. It was, what was written there was, financial hero, businessman, and broker Chaim Solomon was responsible for raising most of the money needed to finance the American Revolution and later to save the new nation from collapse. So there, almost 200 years after his efforts and 190 years after his death, he was somewhat recognized. Having said that, folklore, legend, or possibly the truth tells us that there was another way in which his efforts were recognized, and they are to be found in the back pocket of almost every American citizen. The way the legend goes, George Washington asked Chaim Solomon, "How can I repay you?" And Chaim Solomon said, "You can't repay me personally. I don't want anything for myself, but I will take something for my nation," which would be words echoed in the First World War by Chaim Weizmann when the British government would ask him what reward he wanted for the discovery of acetate. And it is therefore said that what happens as a result is the creation on the back of the $1 American bill, which I will try and enlarge. There we are. On the back of the dollar bill, you have a hexagram of the 13 colonies over here. Now, a hexagram is more commonly known to us as a Magen David, and therefore the legend gives it that the Jew was responsible for this particular symbol as a result of the conversation that he had with George Washington. It is, it must be said, unlikely, but it is a myth that continues. However, the interesting thing about Chaim Solomon is that he becomes a model case in Jewish patriotism in the formation of American Jewish heritage. Very few Jews have revolutionary roots in America, and therefore this story of Chaim Solomon helps legitimize the Jews in the country, and it proves that they had played a real role in the founding of America. One last thing about Chaim Solomon, and I will go slightly back up the page for this. He was openly Jewish, known as a Jew, and at one stage he answers an anti-Semitic slander in the press by stating, "I am a Jew, it is my own nation. I do not despair that we shall obtain every other privilege that we aspire to enjoy along with our fellow citizens." This is what he writes in 1784 when he's engaged in brokerage, because of course many non-Jews accused him of being a Shylock and of, you know, ripping off the government, when actually the fees that he charged were extremely modest. So far, Chaim Solomon, who was an incredible individual in terms of his input and in terms of what he was prepared to risk and sacrifice for the early American Revolution. We will now come to the second individual, and we will deal with him much more rapidly because he's a rabbi, and who frankly is interested in rabbis. The first American-born Jewish clergyman was the Reverend Gershom Mendes Seixas, who became the minister of Congregation She'erit Yisrael, which nowadays is the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue. He became a minister in 1768 and was the, so to speak, rabbi there for almost 50 years until he died in 1816. He received his education in that school, but his further education must have been virtually self-taught. There was no yeshiva in North America. There was not even another rabbi in the United States of America, and therefore he must have come to this knowledge on his own and from the Jews within the community. Now, he does refer in his writings to Shulchan Aruch, to the Code of Jewish Law. He is also able to write Hebrew fluently, as we see from a manuscript copy of the Hebrew speech that he wrote for the first Jew to graduate from what was then called Columbia College in 1800, which we still have, the copy of which we still have. He served as the rabbi in terms of birth, marriage, death, etc., hatch, match, and dispatch, as they put it. But he was also a self-taught mohel. He carried out circumcision, having taught himself how to do so. Because who else was he supposed to learn from? Obviously, there must have been individuals who were capable of it. Generally, they would probably have combined their roles with being a shochet, but he actually took the route of teaching himself this particular discipline. Now, the revolutionary spirit swept Sextus up in its wake. And even though he was located in New York, which, as I mentioned earlier, was very British, and in fact, many of the Christian ministers there were pro the crown, and the English did not interfere with religious freedom, as we mentioned earlier, yet he didn't take any chances. And at the approach of the British after the landing in Long Island and after they kicked the Americans out of Brooklyn in August of 1776, he preached a very patriotic sermon. He closed the synagogue doors and took with him all the Torah scrolls to Philadelphia, where else? And there became the rabbi of She'eris Yisrael, the synagogue to which Chaim Solomon was a great contributor. But he would return to New York in 1784 when things had calmed down and remained there. He was one of the 14 ministers of all sects who participated in the New York inauguration of George Washington as the first president of the United States in April-May 1789, and was one of the first to abandon Spanish as a language for sermons and change it to English. And here we have this is a coin that was minted as a likeness of Rabbi Sextus, of Reverend Sextus. And this is a discourse in the synagogue in New York on the 9th of May, 1798, so just after a decade after the American Republic had come into existence, observed as a day of humiliation and conformably to a recommendation of the President of the United States of America by Reverend Gershon Sextus. This is something that, once again, is in a Jewish hands in a museum in New York. He was the first to come up with the idea of giving a sermon on Thanksgiving Day. And the first sermon that he gave had thousands of copies printed, the royalties of which he did not take for himself, but he gave them to a fund for widows and orphans of soldiers who had died in the War of Independence. And he was also the first cleric to institute a prayer for the government in the United States. He was a trustee of Columbia College for 30 years, and there is a painting of him in Columbia University. He died on July 2nd, 1816, and he was buried in the Chatham Square Cemetery, a cemetery which he had prevented from being destroyed, actually. And on Memorial Day, a flag is draped over his coffin. So here we have the Chatham Square Cemetery on Memorial Day with an American Guard of Honor. And you have here the entrance to that synagogue, and I'll just locate it for you on Google Maps. You'll see exactly where it is. It's on the Lower East Side, obviously. Here you have First She'eris Yisrael graveyard in Chatham, that little green area between the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges on the Lower East Side. So there you have a reminder to this individual who was a rabbi of note, but the first rabbi who was ordained in Europe to come to America and take any pulpit position only happened in 1845, so quite a while later. Whereas Reverend Rabbi Sextus is buried in New York, Chaim Solomon is buried in Philadelphia, and that cemetery still stands today as well. I would like, however, to close before I take questions with a monograph that I found of Cecil Roth's, where he wants to redress the balance. Before we think that all Jews were pro the revolution and pro-American, he wishes to point out that there were a number of them who were very much pro-British. I will just tell you of two of them. It's interesting, he makes a distinction between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. He says most Sephardi Jews ended up being patriotic to the colonials, and the Ashkenazim were split. Some were and some were not. He mentions the Hart family in Newport, who were always particularly civil to the Army and Navy, which drew the resentment of the Americans upon them. And on the evacuation of Newport by the British, the Hart family left. And Isaac Hart and Samuel Hart on July 7th, 1780, make their way to Long Island, where they, having been deprived of all their possessions, were given some property. And a little later, during an American attack against Long Island, which the Loyalists defended in an improvised fort, Isaac Hart lost his life. It is recorded as murdered at Long Island. And other members of his family, Jacob Hart and the rest of the family, found refuge in New York, where, having fallen on such tough times, a British judge, allowed them a $1 a day until they eventually returned to England in October 1783. So that's one individual, but perhaps the most interesting figure of all is an individual by the name of Abraham Wagg, who lived from 1719 to 1803. He was from a prominent London Jewish family which had settled in New York. He was a grocer and a chocolate manufacturer, and he was very distressed when war broke out between the British and the colonials, and he attempted to negotiate a peace settlement between the two. He tried to make shalom, he tried to make peace. Clearly, as we know, it didn't quite work out at the time, so eventually he retired back to England and settled down in Bristol, where he died in 1783. So there we have some people who were contributors to the British cause, and in one case, in fact, to the cause of peace. I would now be happy to accept any questions. Whether I can answer them or not, I don't know, but happy to place myself in your hands nonetheless. I'm not seeing the chat at the moment. Is there anything in there? Oh, hang on.
You want to stop sharing your screen and then everyone will come back in.
Ah, I should stop sharing my screen. Okay, fine, stop share.
You finished.
Right. Okay, we're back in.
So there is,
hi, Rabbi. This is Simon Myers. A very, very interesting lecture. I wonder if there's any relationship between Chaim Solomon, as he's known in that, as he's shown in that one of those documents, and Solomon Brothers, which was formed probably 100 years later. Is there any relationship between them, as they were all both banking families?
It could be, but the Solomon brothers came over. In other words, they could have been related because of the Polish-German connection. We, for instance, have a letter that goes via the English or British chief rabbi to Poland, Rabbi Solomon Herschel, written in Hebrew and a little bit in Yiddish from Chaim Solomon to his parents. And therefore he was still in touch with the family in the old world. I believe that the Solomon brothers, or the Solomon family of which the banking fraternity was created, arrived a lot later, but they could have been related at some level. Interestingly, Reverend Sakes's brother was one of the founders of the New York Stock Exchange. So they had that element directly within the family, but that's the other individual.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. During this period, was there a flow of Jewish immigration? Were the European Jews hearing about the Jewish activities in the USA? So it was a trickle rather than a flow. In the 1700s, it was quite small. In the 1840s, we have German Jews coming across, and it's not really until the 1770s, and particularly after 1781, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, that Eastern European Jews start moving there in droves, and by between 1881, between 1881 and 1920 or 1925, there are 4 million Jews that come to the United States. Yes, there is a statue of Chaim Solomon in Chicago. It's not a statue of him on his own. It is George Washington in the middle. And on one side is Robert Morris, the superintendent of finances, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and on the other side, Chaim Solomon. But yes, there is indeed a statue in Chicago with his name is on the back. Yes, that would make sense. I think probably all three of them. But yes, he is immortalized in the statue there, which one hopes has not been toppled. Is there anything else in the right? Okay. Are there any other questions? Jeff has a question. Can we unmute him, perhaps?
Jeff, you're on.
It's more of a point than a question. It is reported that when Chaim was translating for the Hessian troops, that there was a burglary stolen, and he interceded with the officers with whom he was dealing, and he had the silver returned, and that he ran services, I think about once a month in the shul for the German conscripts who were in the Hessian troops, because they were just conscripted; they weren't professional soldiers.
Yes, that could be, although there would not have been many Jews, depending which states they came from, because most German states had still not readmitted Jews. Bavaria, Prussia did not have many. The area of the Rhineland did. So there would have been some, but I'm not sure how numerous they would have been.
That Malcolm Sender has a...
Thank you for two.
Sorry, Jeff. Okay. Malcolm, your hand is up. Is that on purpose, by mistake?
Okay, we have here, I seem to remember from Pirates of the Caribbean that some of them escaped from the West Indies to go to New York. Well, there is the whole story of Captain Hook and one of the Jews who sailed with him and brought his piracy to an end. But yeah, that's subject of another talk altogether. But yes, there were some, but there were also some that went the other way from New York to the West Indies, perhaps even more than that way around, seeking their fortunes. Isn't the Spanish Portuguese it's nowadays is in Upper Manhattan. It started its life in Lower Manhattan. In fact, beneath the wall, beneath Wall Street as it is today, it was beneath that, and the rest of Manhattan was a jungle, was just open ground. But eventually, yes, it moved northwards and is the oldest ongoing community.
I visited that shul. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Also.
Very nice synagogue.
Rayful Langham, I've just unmuted you because I can see there's a question in the chat, but it's not entirely clear what you mean, and you're such a eminent historian, member of our community. Maybe you can vocalize your question to Rabbi Hirsch.
There was a can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
there was a famous tennis player in the 1950s, maybe the 60s as well, called Seixas, who was Jewish. And I think he won Wimbledon, I'm not sure. Really? Was he a descendant of the famous Rabbi Seixas?
Well, it could be. He had, there were 6 of them. There were, in fact, 7 of them. There were 6 boys and 1 girl, and all of them made a name for themselves. One of them became a lieutenant colonel in Washington's army. One of them, as I say, went on to be a co-founder of the New York Stock Exchange. His sister was well known for her wit and her written word and her letters. So the family was quite prominent and did have a number of descendants, not necessarily direct descendant of his, but that they would be related to the family is quite likely. I assume they were representing the United States, this Wimbledon.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, he was American. And
no reason that should not be the case. They are unlikely to have assimilated. Some of the earlier immigrants, of those that came in 1654, their names were lost to history due to assimilation, but those that were still around in the late 1700s and the early 1800s tended to stay the course. So it's very possible.
Yeah, he was one of my boyhood favorites because he was Jewish.
Right.
And he won Wimbledon.
Right.
Which was rare. Well, not completely rare for a Jew, because we had a British Jewess who won Wimbledon as well in those days.
Right. Yes, well, very possibly related. Do we have any other questions? Okay. In that case, I missed this, but were the early immigrants traveling from ships? And if you're talking about the early immigrants, the ones that originally came in 1654, they were on a ship that came from Recife via various islands and ended up in New Amsterdam in September 1654. Yes, by ship. Yeah. Okay, Rabbi Eli, I seem to have, I think, put everyone to sleep by the looks of things.
On the contrary, we're calling out for an encore, but Rabbi Kleiman is going to actually articulate that on our behalf.
Thank you very much. First of all, Rabbi Hirsch, you mentioned the instruction, send for Chaim Solomon. When it comes to evocative history presentations, it's send for Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. And that's indeed why you were the man to guide us through this wonderful series, not only the personalities, but the historical periods. So you not only told the evocative stories of these incredible people throughout history, but the visuals, the facsimiles, the historical context, knowing, for instance, not only what the stamp says, paying tribute to Chaim Solomon, but what's on the back of the stamp. That shows the scholar who knows his subject and brings it to life in a way that is far more than you'd read in a book. You said who's interested in rabbis. You make everybody, you make rabbis interesting, Rabbi Hirsch. I'd never heard of Rabbi Hirsch and Sexas before. My Hebrew name is Gersh, and let me reassure the members of my shul, I'm not going to finish the Sifrei Torah and take them to Philadelphia. But we really, all of us, want to thank you for the way in which you brought to life the stories of these incredible people over these past 2 weeks, the historical periods, the detail, and just the engaging way which you present. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And you've made sure not only that Chaim Solomon has not been airbrushed out of history, but what wonderful Abraham Wag, who was a grocer and a chocolate manufacturer and was buried in Bristol. I mean, incredible, incredible pieces of information you've imparted. So thank you very much to you. I also thank our partners. I want to thank Bronsby Park Shul, Central Square Minyan. But the truth is that it was really Rabbi Eli and South Hampstead Shul that brought us all together. So we're 4 shuls involved, but the brainchild and the one bringing us together to share in this wonderful series has been Rabbi Eli. Thank you very much, Rabbi Eli and South Hampstead Shul. And of course, last but by no means least, each and every one of you. whether you've tuned in for each of the sessions or just for tonight or whenever you've participated. Not only have we shared history, but there's an achdus, there's a spirit of unity and coming together, which we certainly need at this time. And I spoke to Rabbi Eli earlier, and we said we've got to do more of this. We've absolutely got to do more of this because it's been such a tremendous success. So thank you very much to everyone who's participated. Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch. Thank you, fellow congregations that have joined together. Please, God, from strength to strength and come together for future learning. God bless you all.
Thank you. And maybe we can visit some of these places so we can bring them even further to life.
Absolutely. Please, guys, great idea. Rabbi Hirsch doesn't need me to advertise them, but he does take heritage trips. He actually goes to the real places of incredible historical stories. So please, God, once the lockdown is over and with these air corridors and all of that, please, God, Rabbi Hirsch will take you up on that and hopefully join you on one of your very successful trips.
Thank you. Okay, I wish you all good night. It was good fun, and I hope you all enjoyed.